In this video, we'll be installing our TMS ReFlex Kit on an M4 S58. Our kit can also be installed on all B58 engines. To disconnect the battery, we will need a 10mm socket and either a trimming tool or a flathead screwdriver. Once the trunk is open, we will want to place a cloth over the locking mechanism, and that is to ensure that the trunk does not accidentally close. We will then use that flathead screwdriver to prop up the battery cover and remove it from the trunk. We will take our 10mm socket to loosen up the negative wire from the battery. Once it is loosened up, we will take that negative wire away from the battery and tuck it away safely. We are now going to remove some of the passenger side panels and connect the TMS splitter to the body domain controller. Here are the 3 passenger side panels that will be removed. Circled in green are 2 clips that will need to be rotated to be disconnected. We will need a screwdriver to complete this process. We will now use the flathead screwdriver to rotate those clips a quarter turn to fully loosen. With the panel partially pulled away from the vehicle, we can now disconnect the light. Now that all panels are pulled away from the car, we can grab the carpet and pull that away from the body domain controller. Now that we have access to the body domain controller, we will need a deepening tool and a pick to move forward. To begin, we will be removing the cover to the body domain control. With the cover pulled away, we can set it to the side and access connector 3B. With 3B pulled away, we can now take the connector away from the connector housing. With that removed, we can use our depinning tool and depin wire in position 1 and the wire in position 24. With those 2 wires depinned, go ahead and grab the TMS splitter. And in position 1, we'll be placing the red wire from the splitter. And in position 24, we will be placing the black wire. Make sure to give the wires a little tug to make sure that they are nice and secure. Slide the connector back in. We can now move on to connector 7B. With connector 7B pulled away, we can now remove the connector from the connector housing. And we will be depinning wires in pin 35 and 36. With those 2 removed, we can now use the green and yellow wire from the splitter, and we will place the green wire in pin 35 and the yellow wire in pin 36. With those in, we can place the black connector back into connector 7B. We can now grab the blank connector that comes with the TMS kit. The first thing you'll want to do is remove the locking clip. In position 1 will be the power wire, which will be a yellow and green wire. In position 2 will be PT can high, which will be a yellow and black wire. In position 3 will be PT can high, which will be a yellow and white wire. and in position 4 will be the ground wire, which is black and brown. Now, depending on the make and model of your vehicle, these colors will be different. With all the wires in, we can place that white locking clip back in, and we can now connect that to the TMS splitter. Once pushed forward, go ahead and move that locking clip forward as well. We can now grab the cover and route the TMS splitter through the cover and place that back on the body domain controller. We can now remove the strut bar and engine cover. To do this, you will need a 13 and 15 millimeter socket. We are now going to create the engine bay access hole. To do this, we will need a flathead screwdriver. The first thing we will want to do is remove the firewall access panel. With that removed, we can now use the flathead screwdriver and pry out the grommet. We are now going to be installing and routing the TMS ReFlex harness. Here is a diagram of the ReFlex harness. Highlighted in green is the ethanol sensor, which is recommended to begin routing first. Now that we have connected the ethanol sensor, we can move over to the fuel injector wires. We routed our fuel injector wires next to the fuel rail. Depending on your make and model, you may end up finding a different place to route this wire. We are now going to route and install the PCV connectors. To do this, you will need a flathead screwdriver. The first thing we need to do is route the PCV power cable. We will be routing ours across the front of the engine towards the air intake. We can now use the flathead screwdriver to remove the air intake. With the air intake removed, we can now access the PCV sensor. With the PCV connector from the car disconnected, we can now connect that to the female connector from our harness. We will then take the male connector and plug that back into the PCV sensor. We are now going to route the intake cam, map, and crank connectors. we will be routing our cables back and behind the engine. You will want to pull the cables up from behind the engine near the intake manifold. Now that we have reached the intake manifold, we can take the crank connectors and push that behind the engine. Now that we have the intake cam connectors routed, we can disconnect the intake cam connector from the car and connect that into our harness. And the last connector for the intake cam will plug back into the intake cam sensor. Moving over to the right side of the intake manifold, we can disconnect the TMAP connector. With that connector disconnected, we can connect that into our harness, and the last connector we can plug back into the TMAP sensor. If you have the B58 Gen 1 or are tuning with boot mod or MHD, you will need the charge pipe extension cable. To create the firewall access hole and connect the TMS circular connector to the splitter, you will need a drill and a 1/2-inch drill bit. We will want to grab this white connector that holds this fabric cloth to the firewall and pull away from the firewall. You will see this grommet, and this is where you will be drilling the 1/2-inch hole to send the TMS circular connector through. We can now connect the circular connector from the ReFlex harness to either of the circular connectors on the TMS splitter. To connect the crank case sensor, we will need to remove the skid plate. The tools needed to remove the skid plate are a 16 and an 8mm socket. With the skid plate removed, circled in green is where the crank sensor is located. To connect the crankcase sensor, we will need a pair of angled pliers. We will use these angled pliers to reach up to the crankcase connector and disconnect it. With the crankcase connector disconnected, we can reach up and grab our 2 crankcase connectors. We will take the female end of our crankcase connector and plug that into the connector we just disconnected. With the last connector remaining, we will plug that back into the crankcase sensor. We are now going to connect the pressure sensor cable to the fuel PSI connector located on the ReFlex harness. We can now connect the TMS ReFlex harness to the ReFlex. When placing the ReFlex bracket, There is a correct and incorrect way to do this. On the left-hand side is the wrong way to install the bracket. On the right-hand side is the correct way to install the bracket.